Hey guys, aka 88 on Cars. Today I'm going to talk about the best car I ever owned. Even more impressive, I owned it over 12 years ago and bought it in my early 20s. Today I'm going to give you 3 reasons why in 2022 you should consider buying a Porsche Boxster S. I'm also going to talk you through the modifications that I did, and I would tell you about, if I were to do it all again, those that I would definitely do again from those that I would completely avoid. Let's get into it. So reason number 1 was it was a car of two sorts. It had these dual personalities in a way at the time I'd never experienced in a car before. Like Jekyll and Hyde, but like without the monster side to it necessarily. So on the one hand, it was this beautifully refined, comfortable, quiet car. And that was always surprising because I'd been in cars that had had like soft tops before and they always sort of leaked a bit or you had a bit of wind noise, but not in the Boxster. Touching the soft top was even a nice experience. Or, you know, there was like a dual layer in there, so it didn't feel like the car was a convertible. And, you know, I used to at the time have to commute on certain days from where I was living in Devon all the way up to basically Somerset and back in a day. So it's quite a long, you know, 300 miles. And I always enjoyed it. And to this day, it's probably genuinely still one of the most comfortable cars I think I've ever really sat in, which is amazing. So that was like one side. Then on the other side, you had this, if you put your foot down and came over 3000 RPM, suddenly this like snarling, beautifully sounding, pretty quick car would just sort of jump out at you, out the woodwork. And it's pretty unexpected. And then you sort of pushed it into corners, or, you know, you had it on the straight, and it was just this, it was like I got out of one car and sort of jumped into a brand new car or completely different car that did something completely better. And having that dual personality, I've come to learn that sort of two versions of the same car is typically a good sign of a car that's been really well thought out and really well made. So reason number 2 was the way the car made me feel. Now, we all feel something for cars. I feel like if we didn't, we probably wouldn't be into cars and we probably wouldn't be into the hobby. And there's a variety of reasons why we feel a certain way about a car. Perhaps it was that dream car that we always wanted to have, either as a kid or as a teenager, or perhaps it's a project car that doesn't really make financial sense, but it's just something that we enjoy. I think this was something quite different with the Boxster. I never really dreamed of having that car when I was younger. In fact, always used to remember that I used to rip a friend of mine at the time, his dad who bought one. You know, why would you buy a Porsche? They all look the same. When you actually get ready to buy one, and I think this is true with many things, I think actually your feelings change, and actually the fact that they have a classic look is actually pretty good because they remain timeless and don't age quite quickly. But when I was in the Boxster, and again, it doesn't matter whether I was commuting or it was a lovely summer's day and I had the roof down and I was going for a drive, it just made the whole experience so substantial. And substantial is a good word because every part of the car felt substantial. It felt substantial in the interior. You could tell that just real quality had been put into the thought. You know, you press the buttons and use the stereo. You know, it's like the smaller things, like if the car detected it had been sort of stationary for 2 weeks, it would go into power saving mode and shut off various parts of like the car alarm system, and just that's very thoughtful, right? Like I hadn't had that before in sort of late 90s, early 2000 hatches. Do you know what I mean? Like so that was really surprising, and that added to the car's flavour in every respect, where, you know, and just made it much more enjoyable. So reason number 3 is that sound it make. And that sounds cliche, and I apologise, but even when the car was in the stock form, it made a beautiful symphony of sound. Something that to that date I hadn't really been able to replicate. And to this day I haven't heard that many cars that sounded quite as good as the Boxster S sounded. Now, I granted, I know 6-cylinder or more cylinder engines have the temptation to sound nicer than 4 cylinders, but again, that's not true. You know, I think the S2000 on full chat sounds pretty good in itself. But this was a different type of sound. You know, you pass that magical 3.5, 4,000 RPM rev range, and suddenly this soul-shaking, supercar-esque sound came out of the engine, and it was just, there was something so rewarding in that. And again, it was rewarding in the stock form, let alone when we put a really nice exhaust system and did some other things which I'll talk about next that just made it sound amazing. So I hope these reasons were interesting. Now, as you could probably tell from the boyish looks that I had 12 years ago versus today, the car was owned quite a while ago, and obviously being in my 20s, I was obviously going to play around with the car and do some modifications. So at the time I did a pretty substantial build at the time. Not substantial in terms of stuff that was done, just in terms of spend. Modifying anything with a Porsche badge tends to not be particularly cheap. But I still had a good time doing it. So why don't I show you what I did, where we started off and where we got to in a little bit more detail now. Let's check it out. So as you can see, I bought the car almost bone stock. The car had some great options. I think it had PSM and a few other tiny parts added to it, but otherwise was a relatively stock but good example of Boxster S. It had these terrible looking wheels on it. I always hated them. I think actually surprisingly they were 18-inch wheels at the time, but they just looked terrible. So one of the first things that I did was to swap them for these replica 911 19-inch wheels. I resisted the urge at the time to put what was 996 turbo wheels on, as that was a fairly common mod, and dare I say a little bit common and a little bit, I want to use the word chavvy, terrible word, but yeah, it really didn't suit the car as much as these wheels. I thought this improved the car's looks magnificently. So the first thing I really wanted to change was the clutch in the car. So the car, when I bought it, and it was about 8 to 10 years old, as I said, had about 50,000 miles on the clock, and the clutch bite point was quite high, so I thought this is one of the things I want to change just for peace of mind. Now, actually, ironically learned later on that actually Boxsters actually have naturally quite a high bite point on the clutch, and actually the clutch could have gone on for a little bit longer when we took it out, but actually it was a good thing. Now, I didn't want to do standard for standard, so I replaced it with an organic SAS clutch, which was really great quality and actually a really, really good decision. The other thing I wanted to do whilst I was there is, and this was part of a consequence of reading too many forum posts, is I was a little bit tainted by the dreaded main seal bearing failure that seems to be pouted over Porsches of this age. I've later learned that actually that in most cases the amount of failures that members, especially in the car forums, actually had were incredibly minimal, and most of them said it was the sort of thing that would go in the first 2 or 3 years of ownership, and if you made it past that, you'd normally be pretty all good. Now the other thing was, I wanted to just do some breathable mods to the car. So I think the Boxster S, especially the 996, was known by Porsche to be under-designed in parts to make sure it fitted into the Porsche lineup quite conveniently. So for example, I think one of the standard exhaust manifolds were like notoriously tiny as a way of restricting the power to a certain degree. Also the inlet manifolds I think on these were plastic, and again there was a load of things such as that which Porsche did to sort of stifle the car's performance. So the first thing I did was focus on the exhaust system. Now 20-year-old Alex got very excited when he found a set of exhaust manifolds from Jap Speed, I think they were, for £140 on eBay. I bought them on a whim, and when they showed up I was really surprised that actually the quality was pretty good, and actually they turned out to be really great, which is just a bit ironic. Now the exhaust system I actually bought from a company called Design 911, and they're actually the people that I bought the rest of these parts from, and actually are still in existence today, and I understand going pretty strong, which is not surprising because they offered a great service, and I used their fitting service as well, based up in Essex initially. I don't know if they're still there. So I bought one of their exhaust systems. I looked to the inlet side next, and inlet manifolds were a little bit too expensive, and I didn't really want to go quite that far, so I decided that I was going to do one of Design 911's induction systems and piping, and I went for a air splitter as well from Design 911. Now this thing was beautifully well made, but let's talk about whether it was actually worth the expense of it a little bit later on in the video. And the idea with that was it was basically supposed to make the engine more breathable, so it fitted to my breathable mod standard. So that was the next bunch of stuff that we looked to put on. So one of the last things that we did whilst we were there is I decided to put a Revo ECU tune on the car as well. I've never to this day, and actually since remapped an NA car, so this was going to be an interesting experience to see if it actually added anything to it. Other than that, we just had a number of serviceable items. I think I also bought a Lighten auxiliary pulley as well. If you've watched my prior videos, you probably know the lesson that I've learned about those little things anyway. So my best friend Ross and I decided that we were going to pack up and go up to Essex and turn it into a bit of a sort of, you know, Southwest boys adventure to the big city, in as cringe as that sounds. But we had a great time. Ross certainly had a very great time getting mildly inebriated randomly one evening by himself. That was great fun. And we took the car and dropped it off at Design 911's workshop. I was very excited. And then we went all the way back down to the southwest before waiting a number of weeks before the car was ready. So after that, what did the car make? Well, I think we rolling roadied the car as standard, and it rolling roaded to I think about 245 brake horsepower in the standard form. And when we were finishing it, roaded 255. So we spent some money for 10 brake horsepower extra. Now, there's more to tell than just the power standard, and actually what we did achieve was a much more linear graph. I mean, it was pretty linear to start off with, but we flattened it out a bit more. But actually, the one thing that was made amazingly more improved was the sound of it. And again, as I said earlier, the sound of the Boxster standard was something quite amazing anyway. The sound that it made afterwards was just a pure symphony. Check out this clip. I know we might have seen that one earlier, but again, any excuse to replay it, it sounded amazing. Absolutely amazing. No regrets at all. Now, if I were to do it all again, modification-wise, what are the things that I would do from those that I wouldn't? And is there anything that I would redo that I didn't do in the original one? Lots of do's and don'ts there. So let's talk about firstly the things that I would do again. I would definitely do the sashed clutch. The clutch changed the feel of the car and is a great mod, and actually one of those mods that I've learned that actually changing the clutch, changing light and flywheels, changing engine mounts over time are these non-power mods but just make such an improvement to the way that the car drives. I would definitely change both the exhaust system and the exhaust manifolds. The exhaust manifolds, again, just so terribly undersized, and again it made such a very, very nice sound. The other thing that I would also probably do is just, again, change the main seal bearing and keep the car serviced. I wouldn't do it if that was the only thing to do. I would only do it if I was going to change the clutch. I think that's another thing that's always worth doing. On to the things that I wouldn't do again. I think that the modifications to the inlet system that I did probably didn't merit the return. I think I'd probably still do the induction kit, but I don't think I'd do the air splitter. I wouldn't do that. I also wouldn't do light and auxiliary pulleys. This is the one thing, you don't need to change light and auxiliary pulleys. If you can buy a pulley for like 20-30 quid, that's fine, then do it. Otherwise, really don't bother. Unless you're doing like a short pulley system that's like removing some of the stuff, like the tensioner, for example, that's on the auxiliary belt system. Ironically, that's very easy to do in VX220 turbos, the car, my late father's car that I have at the moment, and that is worth doing because just removing the tensioner saves some weight, but otherwise I wouldn't do it. The other thing that I probably wouldn't do is I probably wouldn't do the engine remap on any car. I'm just not convinced that it really added the potential on the Boxster. Now, the other thing that we really struggled with the Boxster was because it was mid-engine and fairly well sort of insulated within the car, we really struggled with inlet temperatures as well. I'm going to show you some graphs here, which is actually the amount that the car had to retard the ignition timings because of NOx sensors, and actually some of the inlet temperatures we were getting here was sort of crazy high when, you know, again, considering, you know, current car VX220 with a charge cooler on it, you know, inlet temperatures almost never sort of go above 30 degrees even on the track. So yeah, I'm not sure if that was worth it. In terms of things that I would do again, I probably would actually just take the plunge and replace the inlet manifold systems themselves. Most of this engine is basically just originally from, certainly in the 986, is just pulled from you know, an old 911. So actually a lot of the parts are interchangeable. In fact, everything on the Porsche Boxster S, like from the doors forward, are basically just a 911. Even the lights are interchangeable. You know, they literally just pop out. You can swap in 996. equivalent lights at the time, there's no difference at all. So I think inlet manifold systems is something that I would definitely look into. Guys, I hope this has been a good video as to why 12 years on, the 986 Boxster S is still a fantastic car that you should definitely check out. These cars are still going for very little money right now. I think 3 to 5 grand will buy you a relatively decent Boxster S. If you're in the market for that sort of car, that's getting down to MX-5 money. And actually, even though the cars are slightly older, they've proven over the course of time to be pretty reliable. So I'd really recommend you checking them out. Also, similarly, that success seems to have carried over to the next generation of Boxsters and Caymans, and actually one of the cars that I would seriously consider again is a Cayman S, or one of the GT equivalents as they're now going into. I think those are a real rival to some of the best things that Lotus is kicking out these days. What did you think of the video? If you thought it was any good, let me know, give me a like. Any comments, anything you wanted to discuss, please do leave me a comment. I do try to read and reply to all the comments. And if you would like this content and would like to see more, please do give a subscribe. It really does help. Thanks so much. Catch you in the next one.